Policy Radio. This is the Comics Podcast. This is your host, Elon 11. And this is the Comics Podcast for folks who like their comics and science fiction with political subtext and political text. Because from Green Arrow to Star Trek, it's always been there. Even if you were just a child and weren't able to notice it at the time, you're a grown-up now, and you can notice it now and appreciate it, even if you couldn't before. That's right. Today I'm interviewing two writers, a creative team, who are embarking on a number of politically adjacent comics projects, including such as Green Arrow, which is just coming to a close right now, the comic, not the show. And I'm really excited to have them joining me again. This is Jackson Lanzing and Collin Kelly. They are screenwriters and New York Times Bestselling comic book creators known for Joyride at Boom Studios, Gotham City Garage at DC Comics, working with Alyssa Milano on Hacktivist, who I actually have done activist work with myself because it's a small world. Actually, how do you pronounce your fantasy comic?
Zojaqan.
Zojaqan. Thank you. Yeah. At Vault.
It's cool. It's a nonsense word. We don't expect you to be able to pronounce it on first try. I don't know why we named the book that. It's been a huge problem for us.
Well, at least it'll be easier to make sure that you have your own hashtag that no one else will be using for anything else.
True.
Well, they recently finished a 3-issue run on Green Arrow to close out the series and announced Dark One with fantasy titan Brandon Sanderson at Vault. And in April, they'll be launching Star Trek Year 5, number 1, which they are also showrunning. They are also known in the gaming community for their innovative live play RPG shows, Vast and Champions of the Earth. Welcome back to the show, guys.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. We had such a blast on here last time talking about Joyride, and it's great to be back.
Yay!
For folks who might not know our voices, this is Collin.
And this is Jackson. Howdy.
Hey, that actually brings me to one of the first questions I wanted to talk with you about, which is creative partnerships. How did you guys, you guys are like literal co-writers. I know people who sometimes co-writer and project on things depending on the project. And obviously in comics, artists and writers make teams that are frequently shifting, even though you do have a lot of repeats. You guys are like a true writing partnership. How did that happen? How do you maintain it? How can we find our own writing partners, even if we're perhaps at a later moment in our life?
Absolutely. I guess let me go ahead and kind of start. Jack and I have a wild little bit of an origin story because when we first met, I absolutely hated him. It's true. I saw him as a rival and, he's just this kind of stylish, intelligent, wild storyteller who kind of rolled into our friend group, and I saw him as a competitor. But over the course of time, it started to become clear that a lot of that animosity was basically just because it was kind of like looking in a mirror. And there's so much that he did so well that it kind of it put me a little on edge, honestly. And one day we're hanging out, and we had been in a writing group together where it became clear that he wasn't just a charmer, but he also had the chops. He was writing this really small kind of a personal, almost more of a theater black box style story about a young boy growing up. And I was writing this script about essentially time travel explosions. It was just all explosions all the way down. And his writing was so sharp and clever and personal, and I realized that kind of was something that I myself was lacking.
And meanwhile, I was, on the flip side of it, I was a little bit younger. We met in college, and I was a couple years younger than Collin and David, who was our mutual friend who introduced us. David Server, who I wrote Freak Show with back then in college, and I had been looking at Collin's work in this writing group, and had been like, "Damn, man, I didn't know you could write movies like this." Like, these were the movies that I grew up loving and watching. I grew up my mom was bankrupt when I was growing up. When my dad divorced my mom, we ended up with like very little money, and so we only had like a couple of movies on VHS that I would just rewatch over and over and over again because they were the only ones that we could buy, and they were all either like Spielberg or Lucas or that sort of oeuvre inspired, right? It was Star Wars, it was Indiana Jones, Raiders specifically, and then like Hook and like a bunch of these sort of just these big sort of fantasy fun time movies were what I had grown up on. But I didn't think you could write that. I didn't know that was like really a job. Even when I went to film school, I didn't really understand most of this stuff. So I read Collin's work and I was like, well, shoot, you can write this? Like you can write like time travel explosions, and that's like a thing that people will actually read. And I loved it. I was reading the movie and being like, this is fucking brilliant. And so I was seeing something that I was lacking, which was this sort of like big imagination towards taking these huge swings into genre. And yeah, I mean, I think as our mutual respect bubbled up, our mutual sort of interest became apparent. And then, yeah, we were hanging out around the time that we graduated school. We both went to USC. Collin was in the screenwriting program. I was in the directing program, but I was not much of a director. We better now, but
much better now.
And we got into this discussion because we were going on a road trip out to Lollapalooza, and it was a big road trip from LA to Chicago. And a couple days before it, we were just hanging out and talking about whatever. And I think mostly we were talking about like our favorite samurai movies, because we both grew up on samurai movies. And we came together on a idea. We were like, wouldn't it be cool to like do a samurai movie, but like really infuse it with a ton of like genre fiction, like kind of like what Frank Miller did with Wolverine. Like what would you, or Chris Claremont and Frank Miller did with Wolverine, like what would you, how could you play with that now? And we came up with a movie that we ended up writing along this road trip called Sundown, that was basically Seven Samurai, but protecting the town against demons of sort of ancient Japanese lore. We were both deeply into Japanese history. I used to speak Japanese. I'm terrible at it now. But at the time, it was like this was something we could really play with. And we finished that movie, came back from that road trip, and found that it got way more traction than anything that either of us had written individually. It was just, there was a magic there that clearly worked. We wrote faster together. We wrote better together. We checked each other's worst instincts and enhanced each other's best instincts. I remember that first day where we like actually sat down to draft together, and it was, I mean, we got something like 80 pages out. They weren't good pages, but we got a lot done.
But they were fun pages.
Yeah, because that magic was working. So we kind of knew what we had. At least we knew that script was doing well, and we should maybe think about continuing to work together. And
yeah, it was kind of like this one's okay, but I guess let's try it again. But like, let's just start this partnership. Let's just see how the next one goes. And we've basically been seeing how the next one goes for about a decade now.
Yeah, basically. And I mean, I think in terms of how you ID that, or how you find that in your life, like my only advice in that regard is like, keep your eyes open and your ego down. We often talk about ego death in our work, that like, I need to be ready for my pages to not work for Collin, and Collin needs to be ready for his pages to not work for me. And we need to be ready to have those conversations and get blunt about each other's work and find those places where the stuff's going to, where we build that synergy. So, writing partnerships, you are writing, supposedly write half the material, but that's not really true. You're both writing 100% of the material, which can often take longer just because you guys actually have to argue it out. And that's something Collin and I think have gotten pretty good at, much to the shock of our wives. I think once my wife was like sitting in the room with us, and we disagreed vehemently on a story point, and we were just going back and forth and yelling at each other and being like, you're an idiot, terrible. What's wrong with this? This is terrible. And then like, and it was, well, we should just do this. And then I was like, yeah, no, we should do that. And he was like, yeah, we should do that. And we just sat there and we're like, cool. And then we just start typing. And Collin leaves, and my wife, who's been in the room the whole time, just looks at me and goes, the fuck was that? Because like that's part of how our process works. We've built a sort of a ley line between our brains, and now we just try to exploit it as much as possible.
I freaking love it. So is one of your tips for us that maybe we should join a writing group or writer's circle?
Yeah, man.
Oh, absolutely. There is literally nothing that you can do better for your own writing than repeatedly subject it to the criticism of your peers, until you can, not only just so that your writing gets better, but so that your collaborative ability gets better. Even if you're going to end up writing alone, an important thing for anyone but, the most prolific novelist is the fact that you are going to be writing with a group where you need to be taking other people's creative input, whether it's a producer or an editor or an artist, whoever it is. And a lot of times writers especially are going to approach the craft with such a protectivity. They have their story and they have it entirely in their head and they have to keep it safe, that it becomes very hard to listen and take critique. But you absolutely need to be able to drop that bullshit and put the ego aside and hear the best idea and let the best idea ring out. And if that's going to come from a writer's workshop that you're regularly meeting on, that's a fantastic place to start.
Well, speaking of art being collaborative, you guys just got to close down a comics series. And, what is more collaborative than decades and decades long comics serials? In this case, Green Arrow, one of my favorite characters.
Ours too.
And, yeah, and it shows. Ali, Dinah are you guys do amazing work with them in this, and I've really enjoyed being able to read it. So,
thank you.
I think you guys, you didn't know necessarily that this would be the end of the series when you signed on, but then you found out as you began working on it, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
How do you close a comic, especially one that you've inherited? That's not something that you yourself began and plotted out a whole story arc for.
It's I guess the answer is carefully, and with great respect for both what's coming before you and what's coming after. We had because even when you're closing down a book, you got to recognize that this is not the end of the character. It might just be the end of the book, right? So what you have to do is acknowledge that somebody's going to pick this up after you, and what you're trying to do is set a really interesting groundwork. Ultimately, when we came in on Green Arrow, we had a lot of ideas, and we've been pretty public about this, but pretty early on in the process, it became clear that, not really apropos of those ideas, but just because there were other ideas already in the works, there just wasn't going to be room for us to do, the kind of thing that we were looking to do at the time. Which was, by the way, pretty political, which I think would have been a big swing anyway. So moving towards, and you can see some evidence of that with our new character, Jace Riot, that we introduce, and the way that they sort of act as a political buffer inside the book for Ollie. But we can talk about that, down the line. But when we were looking at how we're going to end the book, it really was a matter of absorbing everything that had come before, going back and rereading the Benjamin Percy run, really understanding what the Bensons were doing during their stint on the book, and then finding a way for us to try to wrap that in a bow that meant something to us. And if that was all it was, that would have been enough, right? I think then you're really just looking at what are the themes that those writers before you were putting down? Where are you picking up this character? And if you only have 3 issues, you can't lay a lot of your own groundwork. So it's really how do you just land the plane? That we used to use that metaphor a lot with Grayson, because we did this once before on Grayson, the book at DC Comics a few years back, which was my favorite book at DC at the time of us taking it over. I was really huge fan of what Tim Seeley and Tom King and Mikkel Janine were doing over there, and we came into pinch hit when Tom went to Batman and Tim went to Nightwing. And we worked off of an outline that they'd provided. We built out a little bit of our own stuff, but mostly there it was just how do we make sure that we're hitting the beats that need to get hit for the story and the mystery that's been set up to land and to end. On Green Arrow, no such roadmap existed. The roadmap was pretty open in terms of what we needed to do. But there were a ton of things that were in the road already, right? There was a box that he'd been given from the Justice League in No Justice. There was the death of Roy Harper in Heroes in Crisis that was taking a huge toll on him. There was his relationship with Black Canary that was already being established. There was his house, their new base, his aeroplane, all of this stuff that had just been introduced in the Benson run. There was a sense of civilian unrest and outrage and political feeling in Seattle in the aftermath of everything that had gone down with Star City in Ben's run, and then in Julian Shauna's run, the Citizen, who was more of a direct political take on a sort of social media villain. And for us, it was a matter of, okay, well, how do you take all of these threads and turn them into an effective, solid endpoint? for this character that lets him put down the mask, that lets him put down his leadership of sort of being a vigilante in Seattle, and even lets him put down his relationship with Black Canary, because there were plans for that character and plans for him. So how do you wrap all that stuff? Now that you've identified all of your core elements, and Colin and I as we try to do, and I think Colin can speak probably better this now that I've sort of set the stage, but we really look at how you do this entirely from a perspective of character. Let's not worry too much about plot. Let's not get ourselves tied up in the machinations of individual plot mechanics. We'll get there, but when we're trying to break that, the first thing we do is we look to the character, what they're going through, and how they're going to manage that crisis.
Yeah, I mean, being able to kind of track everywhere he came from and all the different kind of things that were pushing him here, it was important to think about not only kind of, and also obviously we had a mandate to kind of get him to a place where he was able to have a new status quo, which if you know anything about Ollie, that means that he needed to be left with nothing. Right? If he has a single shred of something to hold on to, he'll hold on to it to his very last breath. Well, we could not kill this character. So the challenge to us was really making this incredibly emotional story out of what was, 6, 7, 8 different disparate plot elements. And I think that's one of the things that we actually love the most. And I think if we could get a reputation for being, the guys who can unravel your narrative knot, I would love it. Basically,
so you guys are like the Mariano Rivera of comics, the sleeper.
Exactly. Nice.
I will never make a sports metaphor ever again.
If you're gonna make one, make a baseball one, because Colin can speak to them. I know nothing about sports. Colin knows his baseball pretty well at this point.
I know baseball, but that's it.
And apparently, I really don't know sports, because I didn't mean sleeper. I meant closer. Oops.
But I mean, exactly. But that's the deal, right? Like, for us, you put us in an impossible cage, and all we want to do is figure out the way out. I mean, I feel like I'm pitching a Mr. Miracle book, but like, that's so fun. It's when you have an entire horizon of possibilities, that's when things can get really complicated. But when you are looking out and you're like, well, there's mines everywhere, let's plot a path. That's the kind of fun problem solving that we really excel at. And then when you keep that rotating around the importance of character first, we always say that if you strip out all the action, you strip out all the plot malarkey, all the science fiction, all the fantasy, you're just left with a character story. And that character story absolutely has to sing. And this story is really about a man who's been unable to process his grief, and because of that is watching as his relationship kind of is ripped apart around him. And we take him on a full emotional journey in issue 50 and leave him at a place where, yes, he's still damaged, but he is owning his trauma and owning his damage in a way that I don't think Oliver Queen has done in, years.
I really think that's a perfect way to end that. I mean, I also feel like you're setting up. The series I think was basically put off because there's going to be some superhero big thing that it didn't make sense for him to have a solo book in the middle of, is my perception. But it feels like this is a setup for the future of maybe a hard traveling heroes based story where you have a character on the road. At least that was how I read the ending, was like leaving it open for that, especially since he just went down in an airplane, which is, oh yeah, that's a spoiler, but whatever. Folks know this issue is ending, right? Like,
yeah,
okay.
They're fine.
It's okay. He's obviously not dead. It's a comic, this. And there was an airplane. It was an Ollie story. It reflected back on a classic story where he died going down in a plane. It's cool. Anyway, but yeah, hard traveling heroes. At least I feel like you also like sort of loaded up the bases. So at some point in the future, when it's ready to kick up again, like that could be a good starting point for it.
I mean, look, we do not really know truthfully where you're going to see Ollie next. We have about as much information as most people do. What we know is where we placed him, but I think what's, to your point about looking forward, right, and like trying to allow for people to have imagination even though the book is over, that's I'm really glad you're thinking that way, because that's what we were hoping for. It's a very hopeless ending, because, as Colin pointed out, if Ollie has any hope left, he's going to keep fighting. And we needed him to give up the fight. We needed him to walk, again, to speak to spoilers, right? But we needed him to walk away from Seattle at the end with no Dinah, with no house, with no plane, with no mantle, with no suit, with no arrows. We needed him to walk with no box. We needed him to walk away with everything taken from him, frankly, so that somebody else can come along when it is next time to do this and really like start telling that next story with him. And give them a as close to a blank slate as possible to be like, this is where this guy, this is Ollie fully broken down. However you want to rebuild him. And I think it's a challenge when you're writing something that has so little hope to be like, but maybe there's some hope in the future. And I think we really tried to balance that, especially on that last page, with Ollie recognizing that a lot of the life that he's been living recently is not one that's sustainable, but maybe going forward, there's a new life that he can build. And that's one of those things, again, that, like, speaking to the politics of the book, though not necessarily overt, we have all, I think, as it is literally no surprise to anybody who knows anything about me at this point, that I'm a pretty left politically. I sit pretty far to the left, and my general instinct with Ollie is to let him sit about as far to the left as I do. But he's a little, he's a little older. He has a little bit less, maybe a little bit less consciousness about like what's going on the ground roots of and what's going on with poor people and what's going on with the people that he doesn't see on a regular day-to-day basis, which is what Jace Riot was there to talk about. But what he can go through that we can all go through is the sense that sometimes events are so much larger than you, and the people who pull those levers of power are so powerful. In our case, obviously, that's oligarchs and massive corporations and political dynasties. All of that stuff, we don't have a lot of direct control over it, even though we feel like we have control. We feel like we can fight. We feel like we can protest. We can make activist action. We can vote. But sometimes when it doesn't go our way, it feels this sort of like this crushing boulder of hopelessness that can just roll over everything that we have, and all we can do is try to run out of the way, which isn't heroic and doesn't feel like our ideals are intact. It just feels like we've lost. And
the feeling I had from that, and sorry.
Oh no, please go.
The feeling that I've had from that, and that is certainly sits in my interpretation of the story, is that when that happens to you, it's about looking. Sometimes we are not the center of the story, and that we have to hand over that leadership and the impetus to be at the vanguard and to be setting the tone of what action looks like moving forward in the hands of a different generation or in the hands of other kinds of marginalized voices. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it was really exciting to bring in Jace Riot, being a non-binary character who's a person of color, like having sort of Ollie cede the city to them is like, to me as like an activist, it was like sort of saying like, yes, sometimes us old folks who've maybe been in it for a long time, we don't always have all the answers. And sometimes we need to cede to the leadership of another generation. And the best thing for us to do can be to support them and not get in their way, and to do what we can to elevate them. So, I felt that from it for sure.
Absolutely. Which is a kind of friendship that we try to extend in our normal lives. It's a kind of politics that we try to extend in our lives. And it's definitely something that from the moment that we stepped onto Green Arrow, we knew was going to be central to our premise around the character. That this is a guy who the last thing he ever wants to do is give up leadership or give up a spotlight, but that his ideals, because that's like Oliver Queen, that's his damage, but that underneath that is an ideal and a politics that he has been developing over years and years and years that is unique in the DC universe, right? This social conscience that he has. And that we would ideally have a real opportunity to say, okay, what does it look like when Ollie is presented with and has to directly confront his own privilege? And we only had a little bit of time to do that. I'm glad you got something out of that. I certainly feel like there's a great future for Jace Riot if anybody decides to follow up on that or pick that up. I hope they show up in other DC books. I hope we get a chance to tell their story someday, or that somebody else does. Frankly, I hope the character lives on, because I think that they carve out a unique, as you put it, like new, younger place in the DCU that just straight up doesn't exist before they show up on the scene. It's a lot like this new young crop of Democratic politicians who are coming in and pushing everybody to the left because they all of a sudden you have these voices that are elevated that now can't be silenced because they have the mantle. And I think there's something very and we're clearly reckoning with that right now. And I think that's something that I'd love to see more of in Big Two books. I think Miles Morales is one of the great manifestations of this in pop culture, and it's been so lovely watching Spider-Verse kind of wake everybody up to that. So I hope that there's more of that kind of that iterative legacy brought to books at all the companies, not just DC.
I think like one of, I was, like a lot of people, really excited at the introduction of Jace Riot. And, but I think the fact that, this character is coming at an end of the series sort of points to one of the challenges when it comes to queer and representation in particular, which is that when most of the queer characters are ones that that are being written new, that are new characters that are being invented anew, there's such a high risk of them just disappearing as soon as the person who creates them is no longer running that book. So I really do hope that people keep them in mind, especially in future Green Arrow stories. Like, he has to exist in dialogue with what's happening in the world today. He has to exist in a political story, and like Jace is a better representation of the now than he is. But he's still political. Like if you're not doing a political, and he's still a leftist, and if you're not doing a political leftist Ollie, like you might as well be writing some other character.
Yeah, then he's Batman.
Totally right.
So, yeah, exactly. Without that, he's Batman, which is why I don't watch a certain show whose name I won't mention. But that points to the concern, which is like you guys are like putting in the work to set up a really great non-binary character, but then it's not in your hands whether that character ever shows up again or is just like going to be a footnote in those lists where we like treasure the few queer characters we get and then they vanish,
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely share your concern and and your hopes. We love Jace immensely and hope that they continue to show up. What I can say is that DC also really loves the character.
Yeah.
We wrestled with names, with looks. Like this was not a character that we kind of snuck in through the back. Like top to bottom, everyone actively loves Jace.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's a good indicator that in this case they're not going to disappear. We really hope that both the higher powers that be recognize Jace's value as an important voice within the DCU, and that other creators see their potential and take advantage.
But I think there's also a note to be put there, and I do really want to triple or quadruple underline how effectively DC backed that character. It was never a fight. They were in our very first outline. They were in our very last outline. There was never a moment where we were like, can this character not be this character? Like the only thing they wanted from the character was to go further with it. They were like they were backed by DC, which was wonderful, and that was really
good. Editors matter.
And I do think that that's something that is going to continue at DC. Whether or not it's Jace or not is not really up to us. It's very much up to them. But I think that kind of searching for representation inside of the DCU, which is traditionally very, traditionally it looks very much like the 1950s over there. I think figuring out how to open that up has been a long journey, and we're just one small link in a very, very long chain of, going all the way back to, Dwayne McDuffie and well before. But I think there's also something I want to mention, because you said like, you introduce this character and then, maybe you never come back and write it. That's true. Maybe we never come back and write them. But ideally what we've done, if nothing else, is place a chess piece on the board for one of a whole crop of really incredible queer, non-binary, trans writers coming into this space who are looking for characters who don't want to just come in, or who maybe it would be too difficult for them to come in and pitch a whole new slate of characters. We've now put one in the universe. So if you're coming into the DCU and you come from a marginalized background, or you are looking for yourself in there, maybe you find Jace, and maybe you find a place for Jace in your stories. Ideally, this character is a crumb left behind for people who, frankly, look and identify differently than we do and can find themselves there. Just something that we try to do with representation in general. We're two straight white guys. We don't try to hide that, but we do try to write stories that expand representation across the board. Joyride was an exercise in that after a fashion. Hacktivist certainly is an exercise in that. Gotham City Garage was a huge exercise in that.
Yeah.
Zojaqan is an exercise in that. We don't write a lot of stories about straight white dudes. And that's not just because we don't find them interesting. It's just we part of what excites us about telling stories is getting inside of the minds of people who are not us, of doing our research, of talking to people, of recognizing that humanity across the board, and then trying to expand it into our work. And then ideally, if that opens up some opportunities for actual people in the actual world who are looking for that representation and are looking for a way to build it up, then great. Then we've done, to some small degree, what we're asking Ollie to do in Green Arrow, and dropping a hand behind us and being like, hey, the ladder's still there and we're going to hold it for you.
If I'm not mistaken, you also had some characters in Gotham Garage who are queer in that universe who aren't in the main DCU, or am I not remembering
yes.
properly?
Yes. Yes, indeed. Zatanna and Silver Banshee were in a relationship, which was actually something we really wanted to play with, but the book ended before we were able to get back to those characters. But we have a whole plot line if we ever get to come back to that universe that is. It's just like a take on the Wild One with the two of them that I really want to do.
Oh, wow. That's fun.
It'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of fans have looked to, like Bombshells with, which has really been spearheaded by Marguerite Bennett.
Yep. Marguerite's a
Wait,
hero
yes?
of mine.
Yes.
I just think she's...
Sorry, my brain is...
I just think
Yeah.
Marguerite can do no wrong. I think she's just wonderful and incredible, and I think she's gotten tired of me saying it to her, but I don't care. She's so good.
It's a fact.
Yeah.
But like with their leadership in Bombshells, like these Elseworlds have kind of become places for fans to put their hands into a more significantly queer world than you find in ones where people are saying you can't do this, you can't do that from established canon, and it's sort of a space for experimentation.
And I think that's one of the huge values of, I guess they're not technically Elseworlds books, but of the Elseworlds books that they're doing is there's just all this wild freedom to get so innovative and weird and unexpected. We had essentially, obviously we worked with Christy Quinn, who was a fantastic editor, but no one was really looking too hard over her shoulder. And we got to do some pretty wild stuff. I hunger. One of the only, sorry, I'm getting so excited. One of the only things that I do feel like we kind of missed out on that series because it didn't quite get to run as long as we wanted was some more of the romance angles. We were spending this time writing all these really strong, interesting women that, we did have a plot to service. So we had to tell our story, and that unfortunately meant that we did not have as much time for the tender, for the smaller moments that where we might have seen some more of these relationships develop. But I'm really glad that we were able to get what we were into the book.
We also that
you
that
guys
book was
do relationship stuff really well, so
we
like
thank
one of the
you.
things we're there for.
We relationships are deeply important in both of our lives. Obviously, as I said, we're both married to incredible women, and then we ourselves, are this weird hive mind,
You're fine.
Jay and Silent Bob thing that we have going on. That truly,
Yes.
I'd like to think we're more Ted Cord and Booster Gold.
Ooh, I like that better.
That's
That's much stronger. And neither of us are silent enough to be Silent
Exactly.
Bob. Yeah, no, you're right. But that means that relationships tend to be at the core of our books, because and our books tend to have multiple perspectives. We don't tend to do single protagonist books. That's not always true, obviously. Zojaqan is very much a single protagonist book, but by and large, we really like to do either ensembles or duos, or best friends. We love telling best friend stories for obvious reasons.
So tell me about Zojaqan a little bit.
Ooh, yeah. Zojaqan's the weird one. So Zojaqan is our... it's our first book at Vault, who we're now doing this sort of big epic fantasy dark one with, working with Brendan Sanderson, which is just a complete dream come true for both of us. We cannot believe we get an opportunity to work with someone as as incredible and as storied as Brandon. He is a master storyteller, and I feel like we're learning from him all the time, even just as we write in his world. But Zojaqan started as kind of a fever dream of a pitch. That's why it's got that title. That title was just the nonsense word we put at the top of the document when we started talking about what this book would be. We're both big fans of fantasy and portal fantasy. We're both big fans of like Conan the Barbarian and Red Sonja and these very like I guess what you'd think of as like these side medieval kind of fantasies.
Medieval adjacent,
fantasy, but
sword and sandal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we're also huge fans of Dune. Like and books like Dune, right? Books that are stories that are challenging to the reader and saying, "Yo, keep up," right? We are not going to explain this to you. You really need to dig for this, which is just we think is a wonderful way to tell a story.
And it became the way that we handled Zojaqan. So Zojaqan is the story of a woman from our world, Shannon Kind, who is she's a mother of a child who has died in his teenage years. She has isolated herself from the rest of the world around her. She's the first generation daughter of immigrants raised in this country. She doesn't have a lot of a support system around her. She works at the USPS. This is not like a woman of any kind of privilege. And so when her son dies and the world kind of leaves her behind, she's isolated fully and lets herself become isolated. And all of that is preamble to page 1, which finds Shannon falling out of the sky of this weird primordial world that she will learn to call Zojaqan, which is the name of the world that the book takes place on. And Shannon is, for reasons that are mysterious to the reader and that I do not think we ever literally explain in the book. We had some ideas about how we might do it, and then we decided very much against it based on what the book became. Falls out of the sky of this place and finds herself unstuck in time there. She can move forward along the timescape at really, really vast intervals or really small intervals. She can move forward a day, or she can move forward a year, or she can move forward a century, or she can move forward a millennia. She can never move back.
And she can't control when or how she jumps.
Especially not early. And the book is about her. This is sort of how I always... I think makes Zojaqan make the most sense. In the first 33 pages or so, you're gonna follow Shannon through like millions of years of Zojaqan history, but it's only going to have been a couple of weeks for her, maybe a few months, because she's going to stop in these individual periods and she's going to try to survive. But as she survives, by the end of our first sort of double first issue, I guess like page 40 or so, she will discover that those decisions have allowed a civilization to develop. A small, weird little civilization of these little axolotl-looking dudes who call themselves the Zoja. Thus, Zojaqan. It means the world of the Zoja. She takes the Zoja under her wing and tries to, as she did for her child who is dead now, tries to teach them right from wrong, tries to teach them to be moral people, to be better people, to have, not just strength, but wisdom, and discovers how incredibly difficult that is, how it's not as simple as going in and just educating somebody and then everything's going to work out, and that sometimes, you have to be really careful what you say, because in the words of, Sondheim and Lapine, people will listen, or children will listen. They will take your words, and then if you're not around, say you skip ahead 100 years, and you're not around to correct them, they may misinterpret you. So this book becomes this push and pull over millennia of this one woman trying to help this civilization grow and develop and become a just one, and the ways that succeeds and fails.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and the art is by Nathan Gooden, who is kind of he's the artistic visionary behind most of Vault's line. He's their art director, and his work he's like a punk rock Frank Frazetta. It's really one of the main reasons that we worked with Vault, is because we were able to work with Nathan. His art is just jaw-droppingly amazing. It's poetic and lyrical and haunting and it's a beautiful dreamscape. Even if you think our words might be garbage, you should absolutely look into his art because it'll be worth your while.
And then to Colin's point about Dune, the book is actually spoken about, and this actually kind of gets to the politics of the book. The book is designed, the narrative of it is designed as a handoff constantly between two different narrators. One of the narrators is the what's called the Shan Law, which is the book that the Zojaqan, or that the Zoja write in her absence each time to remember the lessons that she gave them. It's basically their Bible, right? And we're getting a good portion of the story from the perspective of their Bible, but often seeing that the words that they have written down about this are not really, don't have a terrible lot of connection to the truth. The other side of that we'll hear interspersed is Shan's internal monologue, as this woman from our world deals with surviving in this like incredible alien climate. And so often we'll see, the Bible telling us that she is this incredible warrior making deals with gods to protect the Zoja, and on the other side we just watch her nearly dying at the hands of monsters in this forest and just yelling fuck 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 and running away as hard as she can and wondering how she's supposed to possibly do this. We talked a lot at the early stages of this book about what would it be like to be a messianic figure like, say, Jesus Christ, and walking back into the American South, or walking into the American South for the first time and seeing what has been profligated in your name, seeing what they've taken from your lessons and what they haven't, what words they've put into your mouth and what words they've decided to leave behind, and how impossibly difficult that would be to be in that position. And so we really wanted to put somebody who didn't feel or look like Jesus, somebody who felt and looked like like us, like an American, like a somebody from the immigrant diaspora who would just be another person you'd walk past down the street. Let's put somebody like that in that position and really humanize that that terrible conflict, because it is something that we all deal with every day. We're all interpreting, so much of our society is built on interpreting the words of people who haven't been alive for thousands of years, and trying to live an example that we're not even entirely certain is an example. So we really wanted to reckon with that in the weirdest possible way, with lots of monsters and dragons and castles, and that's very much us. So that is what Zojaqan is. And it's available in trade. It's a 1 volume. You can find it anywhere. I'm really proud of that book.
Wow, that sounds like really ambitious. I'm excited about that, and I'll be checking it out.
Thank you.
I mean, what's nerdier than like examining the text, right? Which is what's happening there.
Very much. Yeah. Well, we're big nerds.
Which brings us to what you guys have coming up next also, which is Star Trek comics.
Whoop, whoop.
I got to see a couple behind the scenes pages. The art looks gorgeous.
Oh my God.
This is all, good God, right?
Yeah, it's stunning. It's so amazing.
Stephen Thompson, who had done some covers for Star Trek previously, and I think had done some interior work as well. Just we had sort of set the tone in our pitch. Part of, I think, why we were hired onto this book was that we came in and said, like, we're not doing campy TOS. Like there was a thing last night. No, I'm not going to talk about this. We're not going to do the campy version of Star Trek. We're not going to try to like own the Trouble with Tribbles tone with this book. As much as I love Trouble with Tribbles,
yeah.
What we're going to try to do is what the sort of, I think the sort of platonic ideal of Star Trek was to a lot of the people who were making it at the time, which was this relatively serious, character-focused military drama series. And we're like, so that's going to need an artist who can really bring the acting and who can really bring that tone to life, so that it doesn't feel cartoony, so that it doesn't feel too in that kind of like animated series box, which can be great. It just isn't what we were going for.
Well,
and
in addition,
Steven just nailed it.
Yeah, and he's able to approach it with a cinematic lens, even though we're spending because obviously one of the trickiest things about a Star Trek book or a Star Trek story is the Star Trek bridge is a very tight space. And it's just really complicated to get really juicy, innovative shots, especially if you're saddled with a camera, a physical production camera. Steven's not. So he's able to find these incredibly dynamic angles and create these shots that are it's just exactly what you want as a Star Trek fan. And we can confidently say that because we are massive Star Trek fans.
Yeah, we should also note this is Star Trek like OG Star Trek. This is TOS. This isn't Next Generation as much as I love, and Deep Space Nine is my I probably shouldn't say this anymore, but DS9 is my favorite Star Trek series.
I am wearing
I
am wearing Cisco's baseball hat right now.
DS9 is the best. Like, it's a fact. And
DS9 is
DS9
absolutely
is it's Star Trek for political science majors.
I also think it's Star Trek for storytellers. I think it's Star Trek for people who want every episode to bleed into the next one. I think when you're watching TOS or TNG or even to some degree Voyager or Enterprise, you're looking for that connective tissue. I mean, Discovery is almost entirely connective tissue, sort of like flip that on its head. But we're always looking... I think when I was growing up on Star Trek, especially with TNG, I was always looking for connective tissue that I didn't get. And as DS9 started to bring it in to its episodic nature and still gave you a story where the character stuff was all very connective, but that the individual episodes could still give you a big, great, sci-fi mystery that's solved in one. To me, that's like the platonic ideal of Star Trek. That's just just awesome. So what we wanted to do was go back to TOS. Which is what we're taking in, and we're talking, Shatner, Kirk, Leonard Nimoy playing Spock, DeForest Kelly, like Nichelle Nichols, whole crew. And we're going to try to give them a character arc. We're going to run them over a whole character story over the course of 2 years of comics, 24 issues, with a team of writers, including the incredible Jody Houser, who's a great friend of ours, and I can't believe we finally get to work with her, and I can't believe we get to work with her on Star Trek, of all things. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Brandon Easton, who's amazing and who I've been getting to know recently and is just a top-notch Star Trek writer, and Jim McCann, who is a lovely man and an absolutely excellent presence in the room, and what he has planned for his work is a great culmination of a lot of the things we're talking about. So we get to work with this whole room. They're writing about half the book. We're writing about half the book. And we're putting it together into a season of television, essentially. 24 issues that make up 12 episodes that are going to give you... Sorry?
Oh, everything's a two-parter, yep.
Right. And by the end of that, you're going to have gotten this whole season of original series Star Trek that brings us to the very end of the 5-year journey. And along the way, because it is Star Trek, we are going to try to turn the lens as hard as we can on not the direct political situations we're in. We're not going to be doing I think frankly Discovery kind of handled that pretty directly with, make the Empire glorious again and everything that they were doing with Discovery Season 1. And now with Section 31 and Discovery Season 2. But I think what we're trying to do is look at, what are we dealing with on a wider scale here beyond our own rise of fascism in our own country and our own problems with capitalism and the way that it is perpetuating these cycles of fascism. We wanted to look at let's look at even a broader topic of how we learn to communicate with that we don't understand. How do we empathize and humanize people that we don't see as people? And for that reason, primarily we brought in the Tholians, who are the most alien of the alien species that I think we encounter in Star Trek and have been really underexplored. So we're utilizing our time on Star Trek to take a deep dive into the very alien nature of the Tholians and Kirk's relationship with the alien and how he understands that which is alien to him and how he empathizes with or doesn't empathize with that which is alien to him.
I just finished writing a piece that will be on Wired on Sunday, or probably after folks listen to this, about Captain Marvel. That's very focused on those questions, and I'm very excited to hear that that's going to be the focus of the series. That's fabulous and really something science fiction needs to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's something it's something that the original series does so well. It's something people can forget because there's so much Star Trek legacy. We get caught up in that legacy. But the truth of the matter is, especially in the first 2 seasons of TOS, almost every episode is a series of, kind of loosely drawn characters focusing and exploring an incredibly relevant and topical issue of the day. It was a show about allegories and fables that directly reflected what was going on in the current climate. So when we stepped in to kind of start to craft this series, we had to be sure that IDW was okay with the concept of aggressively going after not issues that were topical, in the 70s, but issues that were topical now, that are topical now, and that are challenging now, and to their grand, to our pleasure and their awesomeness, they were like, hell yeah, let's do it. Let's start some conversations.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who I didn't grow up watching the original series, like it always has been DS9 for me. It's interesting to sort of have a comic that's based in the original series that's offering me like a reason to read something that's not about the characters that I'm invested in, really. Because it's sort of focused on themes I am invested in.
Right. I mean, I think it would be unwise of us to take on Star Trek and play entirely on nostalgia, especially with TOS, because it is... because frankly, there's a whole portion of the audience now for this book, for Star Trek, who, when they see Captain Kirk, they see Chris Pine. And when they see Spock, they now have two actors who they can see in that role. We have both the '09 version and the Discovery version of Spock. You have... I still have a hard time looking at DeForest Kelley and not seeing... a little bit of Carl Urban, and like that's a trip. Like that's actually kind of a challenge when you're going back to these older actors and saying, okay, we're going to do this thing in this much more like staid tone with these sets that look like they were built in the 60s, and like how are you going to properly tell stories that are new or vibrant or exciting in that regard? And to us, the answer really just comes down to write the characters as best you possibly can. And what we've discovered is that writing these characters is just like a drug. It's so fun. It is so fun. They are a delight. There's no characters like Kirk, Spock, and Bones. You just can't do better. Put those three characters in a room and you've got an incredible story. And then what we've discovered is that the same thing happens when you put Scotty and Chekhov and Uhura in a room, and that all of a sudden they create a really interesting sort of trinary dynamic that gives you your own storylines. And like we're really trying to like dig into that cast and do some stuff that the show was never really interested in or necessarily able to do, and instead tell some stories that are more, for lack of a better way of seeing it, like tell stories that feel like they were told now, like they were told for the now, like they were told about the now, like they were told, like those actors were alive right now and doing those stories. But doing so in a way that still uses the aesthetics of the 60s series. So we hope that ideally people who've never seen an episode of Star Trek, the original series, can come to this. We're going to onboard you really fast. There's no continuity. So anything you really need to know, we're going to get you up front. And you'll be on board pretty immediately onto a new mystery, onto a new story that's going to take you along that way. It's called Year 5, but, that doesn't mean you need to read or watch years 1 through 4. You can come right onto this book and experience it the way that you would. And then ideally, if you really enjoy this, maybe you look back at TOS and see what they were doing a little bit better. Because it is sometimes hard to see from the distance of about 50 years what Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and DC Fontana were doing on that show. Because it was, as Colin put it, right, extremely aggressive about its observations about humanity and about politics and about science, even if it was ultimately like behind the lens of, what people really remember is, Kirk swinging across the galaxy, or Spock raising an eyebrow, or Bones saying, "Damn it, Jim, I'm a whatever." Like, we do that stuff is all iconic and it's all true, but that's not why you love TOS. Yeah. You love TOS because the elevated storytelling is just beyond what almost anyone was doing at the time and what they're doing now.
Hey, Jack, I just had a really good idea.
His heart was in the right place.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. What was that, Colin?
I just had a really good idea.
Yeah.
With every issue that gets released, we should release a weekly watch list. So it's like the 4 episodes that best tie into the issue that will be coming out that month.
1,000%. We're doing it. Great. Love it.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's smart. That's
sounds-
smart packaging. You guys are good at social media, and I think that will help boost the book with that strategy. I like that.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's always just that kind of stuff is just how can we best engage with the people who love this stuff? There's a mercenary aspect, I guess, but like it's just honestly engaging with the people who care. And if we can do something to encourage them to care along with us, like it's always better to watch a movie with friends than alone.
Writing is a very solitary thing, even for a partnership. You end up in, I mean, I think it's ameliorated by a partnership, certainly, but it's still, it's still pretty lonely. When you can turn that into a conversation, I think the wonderful thing about social media and why you see writers so take to social media as hard as they do is that it provides us an opportunity to get outside of our box and talk to not just other writers, but more importantly, to talk to the people who are reading the work, to geek out about the work, to get excited about the work. Every writer is secretly their own biggest fan. Like they'll tell you they aren't, but they absolutely are. Every writer is sitting there.
You've got to
being
be.
Like, yeah, every writer sitting there being like, I'm doing this cool thing and I'm really excited and I really hope somebody sees it. So when you get to see somebody who does see it, that really means a lot. Like somebody put up there's a page in Green Arrow 50 where where Dinah just kicks the asses of a bunch of these jackbooted like SWAT guys who are about to hurt Ollie, and when she does it, we ran this whole page about that was it was a callback to an old Neil Adams Denny O'Neil page that introduces her. And totally unprompted yesterday, a fan account put out those 2 pages side by side with each other, along with like a quote from our book, and to me, and like tagged us in it, so I got to see that they made the observation. They saw what we did, because we don't say like after Denny O'Neil, like we're not making a direct, because we're not taking from him, we're just like homaging it. And they saw the homage, and they like put it up there, and now I got to have a conversation with people that was like about the process of doing that homage, and that's a blast. Why wouldn't you want to do that? That's incredible.
Yeah, and I loved the conversations that you guys brought about, creating Jace Riot. I mean, it's one of the things that got me to remember to pay attention to the series, and the transparency you had about like creating this character and the series ending. And yeah, like you guys, for anyone who's not following you two on social media, who's interested in how comics are made, you guys definitely have Twitter accounts that are to be followed. So remind our listeners, where can they find you on Twitter?
My name is Jackson Lanzing. You can find me on Twitter at Jackson Lanzing. That's JacksonLanzing.
And I am Collin Kelly. You can find me at CP Kelly. No one knows what the P stands for.
I know what the P stands for, but I won't tell anyone.
That's because that's the beauty of the partnership.
That's actually what the P stands for.
Thank you both for joining us again. The P stands for, oh my God, it
the
does.
P
The
stands for partnership.
I just broke the secret and the privacy between
There you go. There's your
headline.
headline.
There we go.
That's the cheesiest thing you've ever said, dude. I love it. That's great.
Aw. Well, thanks again. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. As always, I'm on Twitter, too much, some might say, ELANA_Brooklyn. If this is coming out in March, please vote for my essay about why Figurative Theater by Christian Death should win the Best Goth Song Ever bracket in March of Vladness. I hope to have your support there. And otherwise, keep an eye on graphicpolicy.com, comics news, reviews, and I have a piece about Captain Marvel up on Wired.com, my first piece for them. I'm really excited about that. Like we say at Graphic Policy, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.